Today we're going to be talking about why the best mid laners in the world are now playing Garen and Nasus mid. How the hell did we get here? So what I'm going to attempt to do is outline the chain series of events that led us to this situation. Now, where it all started was actually back in the end of season 13, patch 13.20, I believe it was, whereby there was a series of nerfs to damage oriented runes. I think Electrocute got a pretty big nerf, Comet got a bit of a nerf, among others. And Fleet was kind of the one rune that didn't really get impacted as much as the others. Right, so Fleet was kind of the most appealing option out of a lot of the other runes. Now, that was just a minor thing, but I think it is worth noting. Now, where the major changes started to come in was actually midway through season 14, split 2, whereby there was 2 or 3 major changes that completely changed the course of mid lane meta. The first one was AP jungle itemization. I think it was Faded Ashes, got a pretty significant buff. So a lot of the junglers were incentivized to play champions like Lilia, Maokai, Brand, Nidalee, Zyra, Sejuani. We saw a lot of AP junglers. This also beautifully coincided with an 80 carry itemization buff and buffs to the precision tree. So we saw Cut Down got a buff and the introduction of Absorb Life. So people realized, holy moly, this precision tree is incredibly strong. What champions can effectively spec into precision tree? Now, at this time, Tristana also was very strong. People realized that if we go Tristana mid with fleet footwork, absorb life, cut down, you get a D blade, you get a cull, no one can move you out of lane, and beautifully synergized with the buff of AP itemization, whereby you would have like a Tristana Brand jungle, or Tristana with a Zyra jungle, or a Tristana mid with a Lilia jungle. And this is kind of what the meta was for quite a long time. Now, also what is worth noting is that at this time, Corki got a bit of a rework, and Corki, upon this rework, was actually very strong. So people realize, okay, well, the great thing about Corki is that you can actually spec into Precision Tree as well. Now, we're just going to ignore the fact that there was that little bit of brief time in history when Corki came out, people were going Halo Blade with lethality. People soon realized that, well, I think that actually got nerfed a little bit. I think they shifted the damage from E to Q. And so Corki went back to his tried and true Precision Tree with Fleet Footwork, which ultimately allowed him to spec into that tree, which is very strong. Even though Absorb Life got a bit of a nerf, Cut Down was still very strong. Now, this kind of started the whole trajectory or chain series of events that started the Tristana Corki meta. So now we're at the start of the 80 carry mid meta. As a result, people needed to figure out a solution to counter the 80 carry mid meta. And now this is where Ezreal and Lucian came in as a direct response to Tristana and Corki, because they could spec into precision, go PTA, and essentially zone them from the wave and stat check them. Now, there was another counter as well to 80 carry mids, and this was Zeri. But this was a bit of a different response because Zeri mid didn't really kill them with PTA. Zeri would kind of just match with Fleet. You would be able to clear waves, you'd be able to scale, play the mid game, and it also synergizes well with a lot of those AP junglers. So at this stage, then you had Tristana Corki. In response to Tristana Corki, you have Ezreal, Lucian, and Zeri, but for differing reasons. Now, out of nowhere, Smolder came in. Now, Smolder was kind of similar to Zeri, whereby you had this mindset of just like matching. Again, you could spec into Precision Tree, you could synergize beautifully with AP junglers, but you could also just scale alongside these champions. But also Smolder, because of the buffs, I think it was one of Smolder's Q or something, you could actually stat check a lot of these low range AD carries. So Smolder came in as a bit of a response to Corki and Zeri specifically, whereby you would just kind of scale alongside them and then pop off in the mid to late game. Now, at this stage, Riot realized that we have a bit of a problem on our hands. Everyone's playing 80 carry mids. You can't even bully them out of lane. Mages were really, really hard to play. Whereby Fleet and Absorb Life, I think, got nerfed for about 4 patches in a row. Now, look, this is where it gets a little bit complicated. Tristana and Corki came back kind of into the pro play meta specifically because in a long-winded way, they were the least affected. That doesn't really matter too much. But this is where Nasus came in as a response to the Tristana and the Corki, because Nasus is a really, really good counter to these champions because Wither, right? You can slow them down, their attack speed and everything. You can poke down with Emax. You can just wave clear and not interact, because the way people played it was with Airy, 4 points into your E. This would essentially allow you to get free stacks with your Q. And it became a very, very reliable counter to that of Tristana and Corki. And it also kind of acted as a flex pick for some other top lane picks like Jason, things like that as well. then people realize, okay, well, we can't really play, uh, these 80 carry mids into Nasus anymore. So we need something that can deal with the Nasus. What deals well with Nasus and can also potentially act as a flex pick? Oh, Garen. You can use your Q to cleanse the slow. You can match the wave clear beautifully with the E, and it can't get poked out because of the passive and D shield, and then access to resolve secondary with second wind. So Garen became this beautifully convenient counter just out of nowhere as a response to the Nasus. And this is kind of where we are now in a long-winded way. We've gone through the 80 carry meta, this weird gimmicky response to the 80 carry mids with Nasus, into the Garen response to the Nasus, and now we're in this weird kind of transitory state whereby people are realizing, okay, well, how do we deal with the Nasus mid? And so, look, there are some unique ways to deal with champions like Garen and Nasus mid. Well, if you think about it, a lot of the time they're getting a lot of HP. So champions that can build Shred are very effective. Let's just go one by one. So if you're playing versus a Garen, champions that can build Leandries and kind of shred them down are going to be very effective. So you might see more brand mids and things like that. You could also, into champions like Nasus, just go scaling mages. You can even just pick a Syndra, just go mega scaling setups, Gathering Storm, First Strike, Farm Gold, and then just scale beautifully into the mid game with them. So that's kind of the way I wouldn't really tackle it in a way where I directly counter them in lane. I'd be more just willing to handshake, be like, all right, you scale, I scale. I'm just going to do my job in mid game a little bit better than you. Kind of have that confidence. Now, where we're going to head to in the meta now, it can go many different directions. Aurora, Azir, we don't really know. We're in kind of this transitory state. I think all Riot knows that they needed to get those 80 carry mids out of the meta, and I think they've done a pretty good job of that with the continuous nerfs to Precision Tree, Fleet, etc., etc. Now, one thing I did want to mention in this video was that holistically, I think there's kind of two things that have kind of shaped at a high level mid lane champion meta at the highest level, right? I would say number one, there is this overwhelming willingness for high level players to kind of directly counter rather than stick to this kind of niche set of pools. I got referred to this interview. One of the other MLA coaches, AJ, sent me this interview, mentioned this interview where Chovy got asked, like, why are we playing these champions like Nasus and Garen now? And he said, well, why do us as mid laners only have to play mages? Like, why can't we play other champions? And I think major or players over time have become more open-minded to the idea of countering other champions and not sticking in this little confined space or confined box of, well, we're a mid laner, so we can only play mages or assassins. So I think there has been at a high level a bit of a mindset shift or enlightenment, if you will, when it comes to countering things and being open-minded to more fringe picks. But also at a high level, I think people realize the importance of a champion being able to side lane. The best solo queue mid lane champions are typically champions that can play the side lane. I had this interesting conversation with Shock where I was asking him about his experiences with his Korean solo queue bootcamp. And what he found, and I've also found this in my solo queue, is that champions that can't play the side lane in mid game find it very difficult to translate leads because your only way of translating the lead as like mages traditionally has been playing around neutral objectives. But because right now, things like Rift Herald aren't really overly effective and the chaotic nature of solo queue, you have a lot more autonomy and control over a game if you can get prior and control in the side lane. So Shock gave me an example where he was playing, say, Hui into Zed. And he would have a good lane phase. He would do pretty good in the lane phase. But as soon as mid-game rolled around, he would find it really difficult to play because the games weren't really played neat and tidily around the neutral objectives, especially in Korean solo queue, high elo Korean solo queue. And he would just kind of get further and further behind. And so throughout this whole 80 carry meta with Tristana and Corki and things like that, people realized, holy moly, the ability to play side lane is actually really, really important. And so now, especially if I'm a high elo player, if I'm in Diamond 2 Plus, playing champions that can navigate the mid game or the side lane in the mid game, I actually put at a very high priority. This is why I like champions like Yone Yasuo, even still to this day, champs like Azir. I think Azir is great because Azir is actually one of the few mages that has mobility and can play the side lane, or a LeBlanc or whatever. These are champions that don't get pressured by junglers in the side, and they can sometimes duel whoever shows in the side lane, even a Kali, these sorts of champions. And I think that's where the future of mid lane is kind of heading, at least in its current state, unless maybe the game changes, which it inevitably will. But yeah, champions that can play this side lane typically are probably going to be a little bit more effective, especially in the high elo bracket. So that's just definitely one of my observations that I've that I've definitely noticed over the past 6 to 8 months. So hopefully this kind of clarifies for you where we're at here today with the whole Garen and Nasus. How did we get here? It'll be interesting to see how the meta develops. If you have any other questions, I'll see you guys around the comments. Cheers.